Today, we're digging into a story that, honestly, just isn't getting the attention it deserves. A story about how Europe could be on the verge of a trillion-euro act of self-sabotage. And the reason why? Well, it's not what you think.
You know when you think about the biggest threats to Europe's economy, what pops into your head? Geopolitical drama? Tough competition from abroad? Sure. But what if I told you the most alarming threat, the real danger, is actually hiding in plain sight?
All right, let's start with the crisis that everyone can see. A truly shocking and, frankly, dangerous reliance on the rest of the world for the things Europe needs to survive and thrive.
So, take a look at this. This is basically the blueprint of Europe's entire industrial engine. You've got these 14 interconnected ecosystems right here in the middle, everything from aerospace to digital to healthcare. But here's the kicker. That incredible complexity, it's also a massive weak spot. A single shock somewhere else in the world can send tremors right through this whole system.
And this right here illustrates the problem perfectly. Let's talk lithium-ion batteries, the heart of our electric future. The EU produces a tiny 3% of the world's battery cells. Meanwhile, China, a jaw-dropping 66%. Folks, that's not just a dependency. That is a strategic chokehold.
And believe me, this isn't just about batteries. This pattern repeats itself over and over again in the most critical areas. We're talking essential raw materials like cobalt and lithium, the active ingredients for our medicines, chemicals, electronics. For the absolute building blocks of its modern economy, Europe is constantly looking outside its own borders.
Okay, so that's today's problem, but the really alarming question, the one we have to ask, is Europe also losing the race for the technologies of tomorrow?
This chart, wow, it tells a really troubling story. Just look at the key technologies that are going to define this century. We're talking artificial intelligence, big data. You see that blue bar for the EU? It's consistently trailing the US and China. A gap is opening up, and it's getting wider.
This slide is just absolutely stunning. It's like looking at two completely different Europes. On the left, you've got Europe's traditional industrial power, a dominant 37% global market share in automotive chips. Fantastic. But then you look to the right, at data processing, the absolute core of the digital economy, and that share just collapses to a mere 3%. Europe is a giant in yesterday's world, but a minnow in tomorrow's.
So we've seen the external dependencies. We've seen the technology gap. But listen, all of this is just a symptom of a much deeper, much more hidden crisis. A crisis that leads us to the most shocking question of all. What if the greatest threat to Europe's economy isn't an external rival, but itself?
Because here's where it gets crazy. A groundbreaking new analysis from Denmark's National Bank has just uncovered a suppressed, almost unbelievable truth about the European single market.
For decades, we've all been told that the EU is this seamless single market. But this analysis reveals it's a bit of a myth. Compared to the United States or Canada, where trade flows pretty freely between states and provinces, the EU is choked with these massive, invisible barriers. We're talking about conflicting national regulations, different standards, just endless red tape. It's not a truly unified market.
So just how big are these barriers? Well, for trade in goods, the analysis found that all these invisible frictions add up to the equivalent of an average tariff between member states of 50%. A shocking, self-inflicted 50% tax on its own internal trade.
And if you thought that was bad, wait for it. For the services sector, which, let's be honest, is the bulk of the modern economy, these internal barriers are equivalent to a horrible 75% tariff. Let that sink in, 75%.
Let's just call this what it is, economic self-sabotage. The EU is splintering its own market from the inside, creating the very friction it was designed to get rid of and crippling its own ability to compete on the world stage.
So think about the shocking numbers we just detailed. This brings us to the most staggering question of all, one that could determine the future of global wealth. Which is the greater threat to Europe's economy right now? External tariffs from rivals or the internal policy barriers the EU imposes on itself? We want to hear your analysis. Comment your answer below and tell us where you think the true risk lies.
Now that we've identified this internal crisis, let's talk about the cost. Because the price tag for this self-sabotage, it's measured in trillions. And hey, don't just take my word for it. Listen to this powerful analysis from the European Central Bank. They're saying that simply lowering these self-inflicted barriers could completely offset the economic damage from outside tariffs. The solution to an external problem is an internal fix.
And what's really incredible about this slide is the sheer scale of the opportunity here. Just look at the potential on this chart.
If the EU could simply get its internal trade barriers down to the same level as Canada's, this mark right here, it could unlock a welfare gain of up to 4.5%. For an economy the size of the EU, that represents a staggering amount of prosperity just be left on the table.
The problem is crystal clear. The cost is staggering, and the solution is right there, within reach. So, what is the path forward?
Ultimately, it really all boils down to a clear choice. First, Europe has to acknowledge this internal crisis and stop just pointing fingers at external factors. Second, it's got to start the tough job of dismantling these invisible tariffs, all the conflicting rules that break the market apart. The goal has to be to finally truly unify the single market, and by doing that, unlock trillions in economic potential.
Which leaves us with one final urgent question. After all these decades of effort, is Europe willing to do what it takes to actually finish the job? Because in a world this competitive, a half-finished single market isn't just an inefficiency, it's an existential threat, and time may be running out.